All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first stage event. This is a pilot in the Discord ticket beta, which we were invited to participate in. As part of this beta, we have invited Nemekh here to give our first discussion. We are currently unsure of the future how we'll be doing these, but we will be hosting 3 more stage events throughout June and July. Those events will be free. We might do some kind of charity drive as part of it with optional donations. We're still feeling this out for ourselves, and we definitely appreciate you coming here today to listen to our talk. So, without further ado, here's Nemekh.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tips, Trips, and Traps of Rotations. My name is Nemekh, and I'm your guest speaker here today in the Final Fantasy XIV subreddit Discord to walk you through the ins and outs of rotations. Firstly, I would like to really thank you all for being in attendance today and for purchasing tickets to this event. With it being International Mental Health Awareness Month, proceeds from this event's ticket sales will be going towards the charity Safe in Our World, a mental health charity dedicated to fostering positive mental health well-being and delivering support for gamers and employees within the games industry. Especially with the current times in the pandemic and many other crazy goings-on in the world, it's increasingly more important for there to be support for one another and resources for better self-care. So, once again, thank you for being here. Now, let's get the ball rolling and define what a rotation is. So, a rotation, by its general definition, is the action of rotating about an axis or center, where a full rotation is usually regarded as a complete circle. Another way to consider this is that this circle represents a closed loop. Where it begins, you'll eventually return to this point and restart the whole process as it's just been done before. In fact, loops are an integral part to all games, as everything that takes place when you play is a part of the game loop, whereas players, we do a series of actions over and over until we win or quit. In the context of Final Fantasy XIV, rotations can refer to things such as movement rotations in a PvP match, crafting rotations in order to create various items, or your job's DPS rotations. The purpose of the talk today will be to focus on DPS rotations in particular. So with Endwalker coming upon us in November, it won't be long before everything we know about how jobs currently play will change. Some jobs may remain similar to how we know them now, whereas others may change drastically per the new design visions of the development team. New changes are often a very exciting time, and as a process that my fellow guide writers and I have gone through with Stormblood and Shadowbringers releases, I wanted to first touch on rotations as a concept and how they are pieced together. Media tours just before an expansion release are very important as they tease the most current build of job actions. Videos are looked at closely for tooltips and any damage numbers to try and fit ideas together to create a rotation that makes sense. Although we must always keep in mind that things can still change between media tours and an official expansion release. It's only once we have the release actions and are able to play around in-game that we're able to confirm how things will actually be. When building a rotation, you first want to identify all of the important actions you have for the job in question and look at all the details. Whether it's damage-only actions, actions that apply a status or give you a gauge, or actions that combo into others, you want to make note of not only what they do, but how they relate to one another, if at all, as well as their cooldowns. Do they result in cooldown phases, or are they primarily GCD based? This all matters when considering how you're going to piece everything together. Now, for any rotation in the game, the backbone is your action or actions that contribute the most damage total out of everything. So let's consider, say, like Black Mage. Black Mage is quite simple in that its biggest contributing action is Fire 4. Fire 4 accounts for by far the most amount of their damage. Different jobs will vary in this principle, but again, you're wanting to have those actions be the most frequent where possible. With this in mind, you can start prioritizing the importance of the actions and make a listed order of what actions need to be used. From there, you can then start to figure out in what order your actions need to be to deal the best damage you can. That all said, while the best rotation is something to strive towards, good foundations will always carry you most of the way to top level damage. So let's build a single target rotation from scratch. For a job I like to think I'm a little bit familiar with, Summoner. Whenever we consider Summoner, we know that there are the following key parts: casting your spells, keeping dots up, using your various off-global cooldowns, and making the most of your pets when they want to behave. Looking at the spells list for Summoner, as is in Shadowbringers, we'll notice at the top of the list we have conditional GCDs, Brand of Purgatory at 350 potency, Ruin 4 at 300 potency, Fountain of Fire at 250, and Eggy Assaults with varying effects. The melee pet ones that deal damage doing roughly 202 potency, shall we say. These actions, they're all conditional in that when they become available and how often they can be used. As such, we can't classify them as standard filler actions. Then we have the unconditional GCDs. And in Summoner's case, we have Ruin 3, which is usually the hard cast spell at 200 potency, Ruin 2, an instant spell at 160, and Outburst, a hard cast spell at 90 potency per target. Then you also have your dots, Miasma, which is hard cast spell again, 45 potency, but also applying a 45 potency dot for 30 seconds, and Bio 3, an instant spell that deals no damage, yet applies a 45 potency dot again for 30 seconds. From this, we can say that while we would want to cast the highest potency actions, Brand of Purgatory, Ruin 4, and Fountain of Fire, all the time, this isn't possible as they're gated behind cooldowns or other requirements. So this leaves us with Ruin 3 as what will be the core filler spell when there is nothing more urgent to do as it deals the most damage. Now, we do have Ruin 2 as a filler action that we want to avoid as much as possible, instead substituting it with Ruin Force or other instants. So the goal is ideally to never have to have it happen, but that said, if you have to use it on the move, you have to. It's better to keep your GCD rolling than not. Now, having a pair of 30-second dots, our goal with them is to reapply them seamlessly so that we have a constant stream of dot ticks happening with no gaps. Miasma 3 and Bio 3 serve this goal, where 2 GCDs would need to be dedicated to reapplying the dots every 30 seconds. Combine this idea with the earlier mentioned Ruin spell filler, and we now have the most basic form of Summoner's rotation, and pretty much how it largely plays at level 50 when synced to AR content. You hardcast your dots every 30 seconds, and you ruin over and over and over. Now, but what about all the conditional actions? We have Eggy Assault and Eggy Assault 2, and they're both 2-charged actions on a 30-second cooldown. When used, if they are a damage-dealing action, they'll generate a further Ruin stack, which has a stack cap of 4. And these stacks allow you to use Ruin 4, the job's highest damage Ruin spell. As we're able to use 4 Eggy Assaults a minute for 4 further Ruin stacks, this tells us that every minute will also feature 4 Ruin 4 casts. If we happen to be at 4 stacks and use Eggy Assault again, we'll waste the stack entirely, losing an entire Ruin 4, so this is something to avoid. Combining these ideas together, every minute we now have 2 hardcast.gcd sets, 2 instant.gcd casts, 4 Eggy Assault casts, and 4 Ruin 4 casts, with the remainder of your actions being your hardcast Ruin filler. Now, while the GCD-based rotation is taking more of a shape, it's still missing several key parts of what defines Summoner as we know it today. Summoner, being one of the busier jobs when it comes to off-global cooldowns, has quite a repertoire. We have Energy Drain and Energy Siphon, which both share a 30-second cooldown, generating two ether flow stacks. We have Fester and Pain Flare, and Pain Flare is 130 potency per target. Fester deals 100 potency if there's no dots, 200 if there's one dot, and 300 if there's both dots on a target. And both of those actions have a 5-second cooldown. We have Enkindle, which is a pet command telling your Eggy to perform their signature action on a 2-minute cooldown. Usually we're looking at Ifrit, so this is a 400 pet potency action. You have Tri-Disaster, 150 potency action that also applies Miasma and Biodots for 30 seconds on a 50-second cooldown. You have Dreadword Trance, and this, when used, resets Tri-Disaster's cooldown, and for a 15-second duration, reduces spell cast times by 2.5 seconds, making base GCDs instant. When it ends, it grants 2 Dreadworm Ether. It also shares a cooldown with Firebird Trance. Death Flare, an instant AoE that deals 400 potency to the primary target. Using it will end your Dreadworm Trance. We have Ether Pact, and this is Summoner's Party buff, where on a 3-minute cooldown, it will buff the party for 15 seconds for 5%. We have Summon Bahamut, which summons Demi Bahamut to your side, replacing your Eggy. It can only be used if you have a pet summoned and requires the 2 Dreadworm Ether from the aforementioned Dreadworm Trance. Bahamut will stick around for 20 seconds, and he'll use Worm Wave in response to whenever you use a GCD against the target. When Bahamut's out, you'll have Enkindle Bahamut, a command telling him to perform Akmorn, and Akmorn is Summoner's highest potency action. Similarly, there's also Firebird Trance that, again, when used, resets Tri-Disaster, but instead of lasting for 15 seconds, lasts for 20 seconds, and also has the property of reducing cast times by 2.5 seconds. It also replaces Ruin 3 with Fountain of Fire and Outburst with Brand of Purgatory. At max level, Demi Phoenix will also be summoned and will respond with Scarlet Flames when you use GCDs, and it can only be used after you've completed a summoning of Demi Bahamut. Whilst Phoenix is out, you'll also have Enkindle Phoenix, dealing again the highest potency that Summoner has, the same amount as Akmorn, which is 650 pet potency. So there's a lot to unpack in that list of Summoner off-global cooldowns, and most jobs don't usually have that many. But, if you're not familiar, that's okay. We'll go through why they are important for the rotation. So first we'll start with the initial set of globals, the Etherflow stack generators, and the stack consumers. Now, Arcanist gets Energy Drain and Fester as early as level 18, so it's a part of the core gameplay very early on. Energy Drain is the only stack generator that will use a single target every 30 seconds, and then this then leaves the decision of whether we want to use the 2 stacks we generate on Fester or Painflare or a mix of both. Now, given that Fester is the higher potency action against the target with both dots active, we'd want to use both stacks on 2 Festers for 600 potency. Painflare is only ever better single target when compared to using Fester on a target with no dots, which is not a favorable situation at all, but there are rare edge cases where it can happen. Or, one case to consider would be a boss is about to die, you won't have time to use your second stack, so you just throw out the Painflare just to get it out there in time. Now, again, combining these with our previous ideas of the GCD rotation, and we're starting to include the off-global cooldowns now, every minute we'll now have your 2 hardcast .gcds, your 2 instant .gcds, your 4 Eggy Assaults, your 4 Ruin 4s, 2 Energy Drains, 4 Festers, and a remainder amount of hardcast Ruin 3s. starting to get a bit more shape again. But there's still a long way to go before we can say, yep, this is a complete rotation. Enkindle is a simple damage action on a 2-minute cooldown. Not too much to consider here. Next comes a bit of a game changer in Tri-Disaster and Dreadworm Trance. This one may be a bit harder to visualize, but I'll do my best to explain. Tri-Disaster allows us a free application of the miasma and biodots, and every trance, it'll have its cooldown reset. When you consider the possible Tri-Disaster reset windows, its natural 50-second cooldown, and where you can use it, this actually allows you to replace most of your hardcast with the Tri-Disaster application instead. So this allows us to do something along the lines of Tri-Disaster into trance, it resets, we can then Tri-Disaster, we then hardcast miasma and bio, we then Tri-Disaster after that, we then go into a trance, and then we have Tri-Disaster again, and then it loops. And this will form the core dot cycle. In what amounts to a 2-minute loop, we are only having to hardcast miasma and bio once every 2 minutes. So there's quite a marked change. Instead of having all of these hardcasts, we're now only hardcasting the single pair. Dreadworm Trance also allows for a number of our hardcasts to be instant with the 2.5-second cast time reduction. So that will be up to a max general GCD count of 6, where they will be instant and you can move around, you can weave better. This is useful for your off-global cooldowns, and then you end your Dreadworm Trance with Death Flare. You never ever want to have a trance end without Death Flare, because that will make you very sad. So this actually extends our original 1-minute rotation idea to instead now be a 2-minute rotation. This means some of the action totals will thus be doubling. Instead, every 2 minutes we would have 1 hardcast.gcd, 1 instant.gcd, 8 Eggy Assaults and 8 Ruined 4s, 3 Tri-Disasters, 2 Dreadworm Trances, 2 Death Flares, 4 Energy Drains, 8 Festers, and Enkindle, up to 12 instant Ruin 3s, and the remainder would be hardcasts. Now, already we have the job's core rotation idea mostly built. We're actually most of the way there just from the addition of Tri-Disaster and Trance here. However, we're still missing some other key parts to finish off. But that said, with how it is now, we can actually identify the key phases to the summoner rotation, where you have your trance phase followed by a filler phase, then your trance phase followed by filler phase again. Moving on, we have Ether Pact, which again is the simple party buff on the 3-minute cooldown. Not too much to consider there, just fit it where it makes sense to. So we'll get onto the final parts now with the summoner rotation, with Summon Bahamut, Enkindle Bahamut, Fiber Trance, and Enkindle Phoenix. So when Dreadworm Trance ends, we're able to summon Bahamut right after for 20 seconds. Enkindle Bahamut becomes available, and with its 10-second cooldown, allows it to be used twice in this 20-second window. After Summon Bahamut, Dreadworm Trance's icon will then change the Fiber Trance, meaning that it will be the next trance instead. It means that our earlier list with 2 Dreadworm Trances doesn't hold, because it doesn't work. It'll be alternating Dreadworm into Fiber, Dreadworm into Fiber. But the structure of trance filler, that still applies. When it comes off cooldown, using Fiber Trance performs the following significant changes. Ruin 3 becomes Fountain of Fire, which grants the Hellish Conduit status when used. And Outburst becomes Brand of Purgatory, which requires the Hellish Conduit status in order to be used. Then we'll also have Enkindle Bahamut becoming Enkindle Phoenix, which, as we mentioned before, on a 10-second cooldown, we can use it twice in the 20-second window. Now, with Brand requiring Fountain to be used first, and we know that fiber trance GCDs must go Fountain of Fire into Brand of Purgatory. In a 20-second window, you can usually fit 8 GCDs. With a bit more speed, you can fit more, but the intended design is 8 GCDs, which means that for fiber trance, we'll be doing Fountain of Fire into Brand of Purgatory 4 times, 4 pairs. And with that, we pretty much have every major piece. So this means in our full loop for the rotation, we'll have the hard cast and instant dot pair, the 8 instant Eggy Assaults, the 8 instant Ruin 4s, 3 Tri Disasters, 1 Dreadworm Trance with a Death Flare, Summon Bahamut, 2 Enkindle Bahamuts, 1 Fiber Trance, 4 Fountains of Fire, 4 Brands of Purgatory, 2 Enkindle Phoenixes, 4 Energy Drains, 8 Festers, 1 Enkindle, the occasional Ether Pact, up to 6 instant Ruin 3s, and a remainder of Hardcast Ruin 3s. It's a bit of a long list, but that's actually everything that goes into Summoner, really, when you think about it. So, looking at this again in terms of phases, we now have Dreadworm Trance into Summon Bahamut, into Filler, into Fiber Trance, into Filler. And that's the complete phase loop of Summoner in Shadowbringers. But even then, other than the outlined phase order for Summoner, the action list only tells you what is expected in a rotation loop and not how things should play out, not how it's actually pieced together. So we know that first we must have our dots applied. And we also want to get Tri Disaster out on cooldown as soon as possible for the future trance reset, but also so that we can have full potency festers. So that way, Tri Disaster is always used pretty much right at the start. We also want to use our Eggy Assaults to build Ruin 4s, so that we can use our off globals during Bahamut without having to resort to extra Ruin 2s, which is a DPS loss. Tri Disasters will cover most of the dot applications, with the exception of the 1 dot GCD pair. We can then use our Eggy Assaults for weaving later, until we prepare for Fiber Trance, and then the Phoenix sequence we start all over again once we activate the next Dreadworm Trance afterwards. And again, that's the complete loop. That's actually how we would create the basis of Shadowbringers Summoner as things currently are. And to summarize this process, we prioritized actions by type and ordered them by how much damage they did. We looked into any additional conditions, gauges, or statuses that actions might have attached with them and what that would imply. We took note of the cooldowns associated with each actions, and then we pieced the parts together based on all of the above. Now, back before Shadowbringers was released, the actions themselves were quite a bit different. But the process was effectively the same, just as we had done it for Stormblood, just as we had done it recently, and how we'll do it again for Endwalker. Only instead of having to build a rotation entirely from scratch, we had some understanding of how existing parts already worked. Once you have the core parts in place, then you can start to look into things on a case-by-case basis for fights, for any other particular case you might be wanting to think about. Now, while it wasn't my intent to specifically give a rundown on how to build the base summoner rotation, I felt it important to show that this is how it's been done time and time again, and this is how it will be done once more, especially for the new jobs. I know a lot of people especially are looking forward to brainstorming how to play Reaper, for example, after watching its teaser at Digital Fan Fest. And sorry, I've gotten a bit lost in my notes here. Double check. Apologies for this, folks. Oh, I must have accidentally pasted over something. Anyway, So now that we have like the general gist of a rotation built, and we've talked about, well, okay, the list doesn't actually explain how things play out, a lot of that actually falls to fundamentals in general. And this is where tips for executing rotations will come in. Every job in 14 has the same underlying considerations when you think about it. When you really boil it down, every job has their spells and or weapon skills on a global cooldown. They have their off global cooldown abilities, and maybe some exceptions to the rule, like GCDs that have a fixed charge timer or a longer cooldown than normal, or you have cast time off global cooldown actions like Old Imperial Arrow, things like that. One of the most important considerations for both points is, well, this is something that we preach a lot, is making sure that your cooldowns are all rolling appropriately. It's one of the most important lessons to emphasize to any player seeking to improve, as chances are they will have gaps in their play, whether it is with pauses in between their GCDs due to things like being nervous or rubbernecking when watching other people be nervous and causing mistakes, forgetting to use off global cooldowns or using them at the wrong times. That happens to everyone. And especially when you're learning a new job or practicing one to improve. The first tip that I've always generally looked at when seeing where people are struggling, and it's you always look at GCDs first, because again, as we mentioned earlier, rotations will have actions that will form the majority of your damage, and a good chunk of that will just be in GCD based damage, because those are the actions we use the most. And so with that in mind, keep your GCDs rolling. No matter what you're doing in a fight, strive to always be doing something with your GCD. If you have to move and you cannot use your regular sequence of actions, try to slide cast or substitute them with a ranged instant action that won't disrupt the flow, like breaking your combo. Or use a cooldown that will enable you to use your core actions on the move, such as swift cast, triple cast, or even true north to maintain your positionals. Even the roll actions, surecast and arm's length, will ensure that you don't get knocked away or interrupted. And that can be a big boon in an encounter, just to keep you on track so you don't have these gaps in between. Delaying your actions and waiting, that should only be the case if all other options have been exhausted. Although you could consider, delaying would let you live, then fine. Because dead DPS do no damage. That's one thing, again, I also tell people is when it makes sense to play safe. The other part with GCDs as well is making sure you're using your off-global cooldown sensibly. An all too common pitfall is a temptation to rattle off too many OGCDs in one go. This can start to seriously delay your next GCD, and almost certainly always will lead to lost damaged GCDs in a fight, causing a DPS loss. When you see people triple weaving or higher, and you just add up every single delay, one way how I would convey it to people is tell them, in doing all these inefficiencies, it costs you this much potency. And when you give them the potency number, they're like, I lost that much. It gives a context. Whereas if they just, if they're just rattling off, they see a Ziva display, it doesn't really hammer the point home necessarily. So for faster GCDs, you can usually get away with just the one OGCD weaved afterwards. Whether you're on Astro with Malefic, whether you're on Monk with your fast GCDs due to Grease Lightning, one is usually safe. For standard instant GCDs, up to two, That's, again, this is a core fundamental, and it's quite surprising even now, even after we've recommended to people for a long time. This is still something that trips a lot of people when they play. And sometimes they may not realize that they're just rattling off a bunch of actions and they think it's right. But you want to have some discipline and weave sensibly to keep your GCD uptime high. So this actually follows into the next tip that I have, which is using your off-global cooldowns appropriately. Now, this kind of speaks for itself, but in a striking dummy scenario, let's say, rotations will play out cleanly. Everything is expected as long as you're doing your inputs correctly. But in a real fight, this can and will change. It's important to know when to use your global cooldowns, and your off globals rather, in sequence, when they need to be used on cooldown repeatedly, and when to hold them, especially in the case of upcoming downtime or future burst damage window. Little feels worse than using a big cooldown only for a boss to jump away, and that's something which people may have experienced when learning Diamond Weapon X, especially in the second phase, and you didn't realize that the Ifrit form was just going to bounce around all the time. In a real fight, mechanics can be daunting on a job that you're not familiar with. You might stumble in your rotation and feel frustrated as you try to correct yourself or try to figure out what went wrong, like why is everything misaligned. So the next tip I would say is practice, practice, practice. And there really is no substitute for it. Whether it's practicing your baseline rotation against striking dummies over and over to develop confidence and memory, or taking the plunge and practicing in real fights where mechanics can change things up, the more you play and practice, the more natural playing the job will become, leading to fewer stumbles and not having to think as much on how to play, which allows you to focus more on the encounter at hand, allows you to maybe banter a bit more. But again, there is no substitute for playing the game more if ever you want to improve. Just play more and try to identify what it is you need to work on and practice pushing through the mistakes until they stop being mistakes. So the next tip to follow on from that would be try to learn and understand why things are done the way they are. Now, I'm very much a big fan of teaching someone to fish instead of just handing them the fish. I like when people are curious about why do we do things, and that's often a good question. It's like, why are we doing these things? Because it leads to a more thorough understanding. Because when you follow a rotation as outlined in a sheet or on a web page, that's one thing. And it's good to drill in practice, as mentioned just earlier. But without learning why the parts fit together the way they do, you risk becoming more of a rigid player, and you're not able to anticipate and adjust when encounters don't always go to plan. Being stuck in one method is a big rotation trap. And this is something that permeates all throughout the different skill levels of the game, where even at the top end, sometimes people can feel like, I'm used to this, and something suddenly throws them a curveball, and they're like, well, damn, what do I do here? This is suddenly really hard. This is also part of the problem with rubbernecking again, when a fellow party member fails a mechanic and is out of position or dies. And in the process of not knowing how to react to the situation unfolding, you might be stuck on what the next best play is to not only survive, but to maintain your damage. And that brings to the next tip. Keep calm, play safe, and keep going. When you are aware of how things are meant to be and how they fit together, this brings along with it further awareness of when mistakes do happen. You'll be able to see them and you'll be like, I did this, damn. While it can be frustrating, instead, keep a note, whether physical or mental, of what the mistake was, so that you know how to fix it for later in a future run. This doesn't just apply to rotational mistakes. This very much applies to when you're learning mechanics in Encounter for the first time. when you're thinking, oh, I was just out of position, I just need to scoot over a bit. Or I was completely in the wrong place, I know I need to be in the opposite end. It's always important to remember what you did wrong and learn from it. But you have to keep calm and focus on the task at hand. And try to recover as best as possible. And if you can, most importantly, stay alive. There's little worse than tilt causing more mistakes and death in a party, and that's how things can often snowball into an outright wipe. If a situation requires you to play safer for the sake of the group and the run, even if it means compromising your rotation, even if it means, having to hold your actions a bit, then that's probably what you should do, especially in a progression scenario, because your rotation in that case isn't so much what matters, it's you want to see more of the fight. Now, as your confidence and understanding grows, you'll begin to intuit more how you can push out more and more damage, how you can push the boundaries of what you're capable of. Whether it's with melee uptime and using actions skillfully to maintain it, like gap closes, whether it's slide casting around crazy mechanics, or whether it's knowing how changing the order of the actions you're doing or the timing of buffs going out can gain even more damage for yourself or your party. However, one of the traps here becomes more of a matter of hubris. Unless you know what you're doing is 100% correct without a shadow of a doubt, the next tip will be always be open to the suggestions of other knowledgeable and experienced players. If you find that an idea someone recommends to you may or may not be feasible, consider asking how it would need to be done, or what would I need to do so that I can make that idea happen. Try it out a few times. You might, mess it up, but you might discover that sometimes a little tweak can go a long way into making your rotation in a fight feel a lot better to execute. Although sometimes it may just not line up due to gear build differences, especially when skill or spell speed is involved. But always be mindful, because there is always something we can learn from our peers in how to do better, especially when optimizing damage is concerned in our rotations, in our general play. One of the more important skills is being able to assess risk in changes, but also the opportunity cost of a given decision. If I move in this way, what are the odds that I'm going to eat something and die? Can I, sometimes people will treat it as greeting when you're pushing the boundaries. Sometimes it is greeting, but other times you're getting a feel for what's doable. And the tip here would be, when assessing if one alternative is better or worse, make sure you look far enough down the line in whether it's the mechanical order of an encounter, whether it's further down your own rotation, to make sure that whatever the choice is, you can actually see if it actually is, in the long run, better or worse for you. Looking at things in a contained vacuum can often lead to less favorable outcomes. And while not so much specific to damage rotations, a good example of this would be not thinking far enough ahead for mitigation cooldowns, because you want to have enough of the nastiest actions in a raid covered. And if you're covering one thing, this is scary, but then all of a sudden you don't have it for things later, that can be a problem. Now, growing from rotation inception to rotation mastery, you can uncover a lot of enjoyment and depth to the jobs that you play, especially when the jobs that you know well suddenly become the jobs you don't know well, because Square Enix are yet again changing them all. In fact, it's often a joke among summoners that every expansion our job is completely broken, and then in a 0.1 patch it's reinvented into something ridiculous. There's always something different that we'll have to learn and change, always something new to appreciate in the rotation. And it's good to push yourselves. Like, never stop wanting to better yourself when it comes to playing in the game with the rotation, because there's always something you can do better. That's at least my general mindset when it comes to lore. There's never a point where you've hit your peak. There's always something more that you can learn to do better. And it's good, again, to push yourselves. But most importantly, have fun playing well, because you actually learn your best when you're also having a blast. So, yeah, I guess thanks for listening. I wasn't entirely quite sure how long this would be paced, because this week's been a little bit crazy. And it's to my understanding that there's going to be a bit of a Q&A session at the end, and we might be able to make it last a good amount. So if there are any thoughts you would like to share and ask, by all means, please feel free.
I've opened up the floor. People can raise their hand at the bottom. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask.
There were quite a few ways with how the topic could be approached. I'm not sure if it was necessarily best way. Again, always think about what you could do better next time. But I wanted to share insight into something that we've done for a long time now, and it'll be fun to do it again. My friend Fright, he's always saying the best time of an expansion for me is just before the expansion releases, when we get all of the new info. And I kind of agree with him, but I'm also looking forward to the new content as well, of course.
Okay, someone's typing out a question. I don't believe they have a mic, so I'll read it off when they're done typing.
Not a problem. Also, again, thank you for participating in this. This is very much a first for all of us involved, and it was interesting to have been asked for it. So we're still learning the ropes of the whole system.
All right, question from Zelia. When you get heated up in Prague, what do you do to calm down and perform normally, or at least close to normally? So basically, I guess the question would be, how do you deal with tilt?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because this advice how I would give for people in general, and then there's probably how I would try to approach it, because for me, I find I don't really tilt as much personally, but I don't react well when other people tilt. And that, I guess, a bit of an empathy thing, where it gets a bit, you see someone getting really frustrated because they keep dying to the same mechanic over and over, or you have someone in your group who's literally bursting into tears because they can't grasp one part of something, and they're trying, and they get really, really sad and upset about it. I guess it kind of, in a way, makes me feel a bit tilted from there. Not because I'm upset or angry with them, it's just it can be a bit hard to deal with. So I guess my experience with dealing with raid frustration until it is one thing that helps, honestly, is just breathing. Just take a deep breath And if you feel yourself being pushed to that point, because there's always that moment where you're like, oh, yeah, I'm getting like more pissed off, I'm getting more frustrated, I'm getting maybe even angry, and you're just like, take a step back and breathe. Sometimes, if you need to, ask your group, like, hey, can we take a few minutes? Because sometimes that few minutes of break can save many, many minutes of arguments later down the line. Because when you're pushing prog, when you're pushing attempts over and over and over, you're bashing your head against the wall. Sometimes people just need that breather just so that they can think a little and let things settle. I'm definitely a fan of like say, hey, can we take 5? Sometimes people will be like, let's do a few more runs, like that's okay. But usually people recognize where, again, if people are starting to tilt, whether it's from, low percentage enrages, those are probably the most disheartening ones you can get in prog. And you don't want to lose the momentum from being able to do the mechanics to get there, but you also don't want to have people so upset that they're kind of like screwing up really early mechanics because they're not able to focus as much. I mean, it depends on the people involved. It also depends on yourself. Once upon a time, I used to raid lead a World Prog Guild in a different game. And I would say I had less patience then because I was more of a hothead as a teenager. I wasn't mean, but my frustrations there would be more whenever a really egregious offense like mechanically would happen. I'd be like, why is this happening? It's good to talk things out. Don't like nitpick and get too accusatory with others because, again, that just kind of ruins the atmosphere for everyone. I mean, we didn't have VC then, but nowadays that you do have Discord and the like, having the voice attached, that adds a whole different dimension, and you're able to actually hear the emotion in someone's voice.
Well, that also comes down to, at the same time, I believe, actually getting along with your group, right? Like, if your group can help each other to overcome that tilt and you're close and you talk to each other, like a lot of these world prog groups, like TPS, for example, they've been together for a long, long time. And I'm sure they're really good friends both in and out of the game.
That's a very good point, actually. Good group chemistry is, like, I would say, for me, that's a really, really important factor. Sometimes you hear these really sad tales of like World Pro groups where the people in it are all really good, but they all hate each other's guts and they end up exploding at the end of the tier. There are a few cases like that where that happens. When people do get along and you're able to actually be patient and understanding, and you're like, when you understand like what's pissing off someone, and you know like the kind of things to say to get them to relax a bit, that helps a lot. I definitely do agree with that notion. The people you're around and the familiarity and the chemistry, that helps the tilt factor a ton. I know my raid group this expansion, we actually stayed the whole expansion together, which is quite uncommon for quite a lot of groups in 14, where people tend to flit around. And we're all really, really good friends. We weren't, progging super hard or anything. We had a few moments of frustrations, especially with like sub 1% enrages. Like I said, that's kind of disheartening when you realize, oh, this one action would have, made a difference, or this one damage down, or this one death we would have cleared. But no, like when your groups on good friendly terms, that makes a world of difference. And again, it's nice also just to be able to banter instead of, and the stuff to say that will make people laugh. Like laughter, I think, is also a great thing to have in raids where you can just like meme and joke around. Because that's definitely like a tilt killer, is when people can be more positive about stuff, even if they've had a bad day. That's, it's a good question for sure.
All right. Our next question comes from Gist of Everything. To circle back on your discussion of building a 2-minute rotation for Summoner, how can this
Mhm.
process be applied to different roles like Healer, who only have a filler and a dot, or even a DPS that relies on procs like Red Mage or Dancer? How can
Mm.
this process be modified to accommodate for each run having these additional items or not?
Sure. So that's a very good question because not all jobs are built the same. Um, so the first one asked was with regards to healers. Now healers technically do have the simplest of the DPS rotations, and I know that that is a point of upset among some players who main healers that I know, where they wish that it was more more dots or more different GCDs to use more actions. When you just have your one dot every 30 seconds and the rest is just filler, that's not really engaging, especially in a game where healers aren't healing all that much. When you nail it down, you're spending more of your time using that filler, which is the same thing over and over.
Well, I
um
mean, wait, so you're also looking at something more complicated because for White Mage you have a size, and for
hmm
Astrologian you have your stars, which do deal damage, but at certain points you might want to use those for healing rather than the
hmm
damage. Like a general White Mage tip is for a size, always use it on cooldown to get the damage in, but I'm sure at the highest levels that's not always necessarily true, correct?
I would say that's definitely something to be mindful of. And one tip I probably should have mentioned in the talk, but this is also like something that we used to say a lot, especially in Heaven's Ward era, like Heaven's Ward era balance. It's a long time ago. We used to say, map your cooldowns, like plan your cooldowns to the encounter. The healer in my group, Meru, who would play White Mage and she would main White Mage with Prog in Promise, for example. But then she's like, you know what? I'm playing Astro in 12. And, I would ask, like, oh, well, why is that? Because I'm interested in finding out, like, what's the merits for it? And she says, well, everything lines up better for Star. And I'm like, so it does. Like, everything is pretty much, like, cyclic enough that you can really get good mileage out of Star. Um, and it's quite often that you can get into that whole tunnel vision aspect of damage on every single job, whereas comfort is a big thing. You're saying a size for damage versus a size for better covering certain mechanics. Like if in an optimized run, you can argue, yeah, sure, a size for damage under buffs will be probably the better game, but this kind of ties in as well to the whole opportunity cost thing, where you need to look further ahead and be like, okay, if I use a size here, is it going to cost anything down the line versus if I use it a bit later and then sync it up to like certain mechanics? Because it's actually really nice when a cooldown like a size lines up with raid wides. And this is something that I always used to appreciate with Ifrit in Stormblood, where in some fights, Radiant Shield, which was 60 seconds, would always line up with raid wides, and you get a ton of mileage out of it. And that was cool. That felt nice, where you're like, it lines up. So wrapping around to the original premise of the question, how do you frame like a 2-minute cycle or whatever kind of cycle with jobs that don't necessarily have the same kind of structure? Well, again, you want to look at their core cooldowns. In the case of like a proc-based job like, say, Red Mage, which was brought up, Red Mage has a major cooldown with Manification. And that also brought an interesting dynamic where originally Manification was a 2-minute cooldown. So you could argue that Red Mage had a 2-minute cycle because of Manification, even though it had GCD proc-based gameplay for the mana building, because in a Red Mage cycle for 2 minutes, or even 110 seconds, like, with the cooldown adjustment, you can argue, do I need to hold it a bit more or not? Anyway, you have your 2 natural combos that you build up. You build up mana, and you get to above 80 for both white and black, and then you do your combo into your finishes, into Scorch, and then you have another one natural. But the third one will always be the Manification combo, where this is assuming like a full uptime scenario, not one with downtime, like messing things up. you have your natural combos, and then you have your Manification combo, which will also be like a buffed one, because Manification also provides like a damage buff. So even Dancer has like cooldowns to keep in mind, where you have Finish, you have Step, you have again these things which will be on like a 2-minute cooldown. You have Devilment as well, and you kind of want to frame things around major cooldowns and figure out how does it all piece together. And even in the case of, say, like healers where you have Pom on White Mage, you might want to think like, how am I going to frame things with Pom in mind? Like, how is that going to desync like my Dias versus Glares? I mean, White Mage has the issue where you clip a lot, or you can clip a lot, especially when you're wanting to use your OGCDs, because they don't have a good on-demand instant. Whereas like that's not an issue for Astro with Malefic, because everything you can just single weave, and then you have light speed on top of that. And then with Scholar, you have, whether it's Art of War for AoE or your Ruins, like you can do that. Whereas White Mage doesn't really have a good alternative. Again, really, it's just map your cooldowns, think about how they fit together, and then try and build around in that regard. I don't know if that answered your question sufficiently, but that's how I try to generalize it for jobs and on a more global scale, because while it's easy to fixate on just like the one job well, every job has the same like core principles of you have cooldowns to think about, you have like resources to build towards, and then you want to lead towards like a good burst or use your tools effectively.
Okay, our next question comes from Kuroi. Sometimes things go awry and people die, make mistakes, etc., which
Mm-hmm.
may require you to disengage from your rotation to res others or to use your little baby DPS mitigation to survive the best you can. What is your thought process when recovering from these kinds of situations, and how do you situate yourself back into a rotation?
I actually love this kind of question, because I always have my favorite times in 14 when raiding are actually prog. I love messy prog, not because it's like frustrating from the mistakes, but as a job that has the ability, like I main summoner, and playing a job that has the ability for recovery, and when you pull it off, that feels really good. When you know that you've like salvaged a run so that you can see further. One of my fondest memories in this expansion was in E4S, where God, I was getting ready to fly to Canada that day, but we were like, "Hey, let's raid before you have to go to the airport." And I'm like, "Okay, fine, I'll do it." And we were progging E4S. This is early on in Eden's Gate, and we had a really, really horrendously messy run where like almost everyone died, except for myself, Paladin. I think it was both tanks and myself were the only ones alive. Both healers died and all of the other DPS died. And it was some horrible cluster due to bomb boulders or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. I know I did record it because I thought it was really funny. But everyone died. And I'm like, wait, I'm still alive. And I have Fire Trance coming up. I'm so sorry, Phoenix, but I'm going to have to do this. And so I mentioned earlier, trances, they reduce your cast times by 2.5 seconds. This also applies to raises. So instead of being an 8-second cast, it becomes 5.5 seconds. And I'm like, Fiber Trance is 20 seconds. I can do 4 fast raises and a swift cast. And then it's like, okay, but what about my MP situation? My MP was like kind of okay. I had lucid dreaming, so I could actually raise 5 people, and I did that. I used my whole trance. The other thing I also did was I swapped to Titan Eggy. So whenever you go into like a recovery situation, if you have the ability to bring people back, you have to play hyper safe, and you have to throw your rotation out the window. Like at that point, your damage doesn't matter. You're focusing on getting people alive. And one of my favorite tools that Summoner was given, and I think it's actually really, really broken, is Titan Eggy's Earthen Armor, which is a 4 times more frequent mana ward. On a raised job, I don't think that ever should be a thing, but it is a thing, so make use of it. Summon Titan, I gave myself the at the time, because it wasn't 5.1, it was a 20% max HP shield. They increased it to 30%. I still question why. I thought 20% was fine. And then I started raising, and Titan, I had Everlasting Flight healing me a little. It's not that big of a hot, but the healers were dead, and Titan was doing raid wides, and I'm thinking, crap, I'm gonna die from this stuff. And then the Paladin's like, wait, I can clemency you, and they were like in can't remember the magic boosting buff, but they were in like that stats, and they were just giving me these buffed clemency. So I'm like, I'm surviving everything, and I can raise the healers. And that did happen. I raised the healers. Always prioritize like who can you raise to recover faster. If healers are dead, always get the healers first. If a healer is dead, don't let the other healer raise them. You should always raise as the like raise caster. You should always be doing that because the other healer needs to worry about the rest of the party. The only exception really would be if you don't have swift cast or wait to get the other person up faster, but they do have swift cast and they're like, I've already done it, and it's like, okay, fine, communicate with that. But anyway, I raised the healers. I started raising other people. I raised 5 people. I raised the whole party because it was just the tanks and myself who were alive. I raised everyone else, and that was the furthest we got so much further after that whole cluster of a run that we actually got basically towards the enrage of phase 3, whereas we had only ever been like hard stuck in phase 2. And that just goes to like show that never underestimate the capacity for recovery. It really, really frustrates me when I see people jumping prematurely. If someone's not given a call to jump, don't jump. Like, if you have someone who's a shot caller, wait for them to say it. Don't just jump because you think it's like, unless it's obvious you can't recover, like all the races are dead. But if there is recovery potential, know when you can recover. And you never know how much further you're going to get for doing so. It could really, really reward you. You could still die 5 seconds later. Who knows, right? You have to play it out. But I think there's more to gain by trying that. The other part of the question was, well, how do you get back into your rotation after you suddenly trashed it all from spending however long casting your resurrections? Because resurrection is a long cast, 8 seconds base. Now, there are times where casting it doesn't impact your rotation too much. Sorry, excuse me. But there are times where it can like be a bit annoying, especially when you have certain major timings lining up. So your dot applications. Now, in that case, let's say you offset your dots by like say 16 seconds because you had to cast 2 races. And then you apply your dots. Now, what I would do is try to get back on track with the core cycle that was originally started. And if that means clipping your dots again, so suddenly it makes sense, that's something you should probably do. You want to try and like get back to where you were rather than necessarily improvise and make a whole new rotation cycle, unless that is like the correct call. Sometimes that can be the correct call. You just be like, you know what, there's no hope going back to the old time. I'll just do something new based on these new cooldown alignments. You just have to try and make do. But it's always an interesting case. That's another example where I recommend, play safe and keep calm, because it can be quite intimidating if you're the only one who's able to recover a run because everyone else who can is dead. Or like when you get that clutch raise into a healer LB3 and then you suddenly get towards the end of a fight, like that's really rewarding. And while you're doing it, your rotation doesn't matter. That's not the concern. But getting back on track, there's ways to do it, ways to realign. I hope that answers some of it.
I'll go with Gist's question next because it follows on to this one. To follow on to Groy's question, is it better to try and realign with your raid or to begin your rotation from scratch after a death?
Ooh, that's a tough one because it kind of also depends on when you die in your rotation, because some jobs have like certain cooldowns and certain gauge resources that they're building towards, and when you're offset from your gauge timings, that can be really annoying. Sometimes you do have to wing it. One of the big points where you can correct like the whole timings of everything is downtime in an encounter. Downtime is actually the hidden blessing where, let's say you do die and the boss jumps away, then you can like try and use that downtime to shift things back and try and hope that it will fit with like the party's cooldowns, because damage under party buffs that's good is better than your weaker damage under party buffs. Like, you don't want to just have really bad filler under prime burst because you died earlier. No, you still want to try and, like, if you can, pull things to realign. If you can't, then again, you kind of have to wing it. I remember in Shiva I had a mix of experiences where what happened? I don't remember what killed me at one point, but it basically inverted my trances, and it was completely different to how I knew, because Firebird trance is like freedom of movement. And Bahamut, you kind of want to not move as much because he gets a bit twitchy and has separation anxiety. But everything wasn't aligning right. The only thing that was aligning actually was Phoenix's heals with the raid wides. Whenever that happens, you get like an orange and healing, a pink and healing. But when you play like normally and everything's lining up correctly, no, that doesn't happen. You have to kind of play it by ear with downtime, if anything. If it's full uptime, that's trickier for sure. I mean, there's not many fights that are really full uptime. I guess you could argue Eden's Promise is a full uptime example. There isn't a single bit of like downtime except at the very, very end when the transition happens. Gaia is the one with a hell of a lot of downtime. Gaia is the one where you can like correct things more if you have to, because everything is so rigid. And then you have the hard downtimes from the mechanics there. But can like try to, but sometimes it is just better to wing it, and then the next run, unless it's going to end in like a messy clear, but the next run, don't have that situation happen. That's probably the next bit of advice I can give is, if you know how to not make something happen again, don't make it happen again. Don't have your mistakes repeat. Learn from them and stop them from happening.
Okay, our next question comes from Miriam. I'd like to ask if you have any tips and tricks for actual physical input, such as keyboards and mice, keybinds, and setting up your HUD, etc.
Ooh, that's interesting. So one of the things I try to keep in mind with what I do is the different ways that people play and the different HUD layouts. Now, I wouldn't ever necessarily recommend my HUD layout as how people should play, but one thing I always say to people is like, oh, does anyone have a good UI that I can copy? I would say, look at it, but don't copy. Like, try and figure out why they have it the way they do. Because what works for them may not work for you. Always like put your keybinds and your UI in a way that's comfortable for you, because at the end of the day, you're playing, not them. For example, with keybinds on a keyboard, the size of your keyboard can matter for like how you want to arrange different keybinds. Even the size of your hands, like I myself have fairly small hands, and so my like key reach, I have to kind of stretch my fingers a bit to kind of get everything. But I arranged like binds with that in mind for me. When I used to play on North American servers from Europe, I actually used my mouse a lot because I noticed that keyboard inputs were not registering reliably. There'd be a lot of like ping memes where I'd hit keyboard inputs and then it wouldn't recognize it. So as an extra buffer and insurance, I would also use my mouse. And I'm a big fan of side buttons on a mouse. I find them like really convenient when you can just use your thumb for certain actions. Even like whether it's on the actual side or whether it's on top with the left click button, you've got smaller buttons on the side of that. Like that's where my sprint would be, or even using like your middle mouse button if you've got like a scroll wheel that you can push. Anything that you find like within easy access. Even in controller, this is a very like good example where how you assign buttons to your crossbars is going to purely be based on your comfort in being able to swap between. And usually you want to always put your most used actions in convenient and easy access, like on your major buttons, because you're going to be hitting that all the time. You don't want that to be in an awkward space and it feels bad whenever you're using it, even though it's the most used thing you have. On the UI side, I mean, obviously you have your hotbars that you want to align in a way that makes sense and you know where everything is. That's definitely a long topic that could be discussed. Is maybe not so much in 14, but in like MMOs in general, the idea of how to make a good UI as a raider. You don't want to have like your chat windows covering a lot of the screen, for example, because you want to have enough visibility so you can see mechanics. You want to be able to take note of like small details. You want to be able to see like statuses and tooltips of statuses are really, really important in Prague, for example, because people will get a new status that they've never seen before, or maybe they know of it from other means, but let's just say in the fight, they get the status, they mouse over it, and then they see the text. Like blowing up status icons to like however much percentage. For me, I have statuses blown up to 200% just because it helps with visibility for me. Some like colors I don't see too well, and that's how I would have to do it. For example, with X-Death in Stormblood, where I couldn't really make out the light and dark symbols that much, but I could make out the shapes, not so much the colors, but the shapes. And the shapes, when blown up, were really visible. And that helped me a lot in when we were learning that encounter. So I mean, it ultimately, the way how I try to summarize like good UI, good keybinds, good everything is do what makes you think less. If you can make it feel more natural, that's good for you. Like that's what you want to strive for. If you can have a UI where you don't have to think so much about where everything is, that's good. If you have keybinds that you can, everything feels natural, you know, that's perfect for you, because you want to not have to spend more mental processes trying to figure out what to do. You want it to feel like as natural as walking if you can help it. I hope that answered, or at least my view on it.
All right. Our next question comes from Nadala. As a black mage, it's kind of my job to be selfish in pushing my own personal DPS. How do you find a good balance between being selfish as a job where it's a requirement to be selfish in order to do great DPS versus being more of a team player when your static asks you to torture yourself by moving for a minute straight, as a far-fetched example, but a way to clear the mechanic exists that requires your team to do something specific for you that boosts your DPS by like 10%? What do you do? How do you find that balance?
Ooh. That's a very good question. I always remember like the casting challenges on like Black Mage and Summoner from a Heavensward era, because I would say that that's probably when it was hardest for both jobs. I think we've been spoiled ever since with like all the extra tools. I know some people are kind of unhappy that we have all the tools. I think the tools are nice to have, but I also think it's so different compared to what it used to be. Where we have a greater freedom of movement. Like people compare 70 ultimates on Black Mage without all of the extras, because you don't have your second polyglot stack, you don't have Xenoglossy. Whereas, you know, 80, you have obviously the more flexibility there. So as the selfish job, because I mean, you're not entirely selfish, you still have Adel. Adel still counts. Now, you know, your focus is more on the damage side than anything else. I mean, Black Mage is very much the embodiment of fundamentals the job, because there is no other job in the game, I would say, that cares as much about GCD play than Black Mage. It's literally the entire premise of everything it does. Because it's all about making sure that you're throwing out your fires, you're throwing out your Xenos, you're throwing out your fouls where it makes sense to. And I mean, there are ways that strats can be adjusted to incorporate like your needs as the selfish job that may need, some movement considerations. I mean, you do have a lot more flex now, but when say like a group asks you to do something and it feels really, really heinous, what would be a good mechanical example? Because a lot of mechanical movement in like hard fights often coincides with downtimes, like trios, for example, whether it's an Alex, sorry, in T or Ukob, or even in Ultima Weapon, a lot of like the really awkward movement heavy mechanics don't really have damage happening, so you can just focus on that. But what would be a good example? I guess if we have to go back far enough, maybe something like Stormy Horizons, because that was quite a bit of movement, but I wouldn't say it was that bad. I would say maybe Pantocrator was worse, even though they're kind of the same mechanic. And it's like, well, you have to do this, you have to take your mechanic here, or maybe even something like
Nala mentions Pankrator, or Pantocrator, rather. Sorry.
yeah, Pantocrator was I have bad memories of Pad the Creator because that mechanic would always make my FPS drop to like 5 on my old machine, so it was really hard to move and survive with all of like the death everywhere happening. Because that can be really challenging, especially when you don't have your movement tools available. I mean, usually you can try and like pool things if you can when you know that such a dense movement section is coming up, but if it's prog now, okay, if it's farm or you're like pushing for a clear and you're very close to the clear, it's different because you know the mechanics better. But if it's like prog early on, I'm kind of more of the line of thinking where your damage doesn't really matter unless there's an interim check where it's useful to know when your rotation will line up with mechanics. That's for sure, because you're going to build up that memory there. But when it's so early on, mechanics come first, like over everything, and you do still want to have an idea of where things line up. But if the movement is really stupid, but if you just did the movement, you'd survive, as opposed to trying to like make it work. I wouldn't do that on early prog as much. I would just grit my teeth and be like, okay, I'll torture myself, but it'll be worth it because we'll learn more about the fight. If it's farm, if it's a weekly, and people should know what they're doing, I would be selfish for sure. I'd be like, you know what? We know what we're meant to do by now. I'm just gonna do my part as the damage dealer. Um, there are ways that you can kind of adapt and adjust, especially like in Black Mage's cases. Maybe you could argue with like again Xeno or Prox, but you kind of already have all of your triple ley lines and stuff mapped out, but maybe you can do some flourish plays, some style plays with a between the lines, or ethereal manipulation. That's always a big one for when I used to raid with the Black Mage in the second raid tier of Stormblood, where I would always be like the AM target because I would always be in a place where we'd want to cast at range, and he would just like target me and zip on over. So that way, it took some of the mechanical pressure off of them, and I could like be the one to give that lifeline. Like here, hold my hand, come over, and I'll bring you over. It's a team game at the end of the day, and don't push yourself into torturous situations. If you can avoid it, try and make it work out as best you can, I guess.
Okay. Just has one last question, and if anyone else has some questions, we'll wrap up the Q&A section and move into the raffle section. So if you want to either raise your hand in the stage or post your question, I can read it off. Just question is, I suppose it doesn't really pertain to rotations in particular, but rather
Mhm.
your experience as a higher level raider. In a static party of 8, is there more value to being flexible within your designated slot, such as DPS tank healer, or is it better to hone one main job to the highest level you're capable of?
Mm. Well, it's very kind to say, playing a high level play. In 14, I mean, I'm not doing world prog or anything, but that's not to say that I'm not familiar with what world prog is like, having dealt with that in another lifetime, and the principles still hold. Um, there is a huge amount of importance, especially at like the top end, on being able to flex, because especially like early on, and this applies to like the first raid tier and an expansion probably the most, is you don't know how jobs are necessarily going to be in terms of their rankings versus one another, in terms of like which one is better. And when you're pushing for world prog, you obviously want a comp that is as strong as possible, especially with the players that you have as possible. And you can be, someone who sticks to one job, but if you are that kind of player, you better be damn bloody good at that one job that you're focusing on. You have to be worth that, I want to call it like a one trick pony, but that's effectively like one of the considerations is you have to be really good at your job to be able to like justify the lack of flexibility there, because I I remember in 5.0, there was a huge gulf in balance between, I forget how many jobs. I think it was like, it wasn't exactly half, but was it 6 and 3 or 5? I can't remember. But you had effectively the group of DPS jobs that were S tier, and you had the group of DPS jobs that were like F tier. And there was no in between. You had monk, you had dragoon, you had black mage that were really, really good. You had samurai, it was good, and then you had like range jobs. You had summoner, you had red mage, and even ninja, and they were all really, really hemorrhaging. And it was not like, if you, I remember our DPS comp for that was perhaps the worst DPS comp you could have had at that point in time, where we had Machinist, Dancer, Summoner, and Ninja. And this literally like all 4 of the bottom DPS jobs. And you felt how much harder the DPS checks were when you didn't have any of the S tier jobs. Like, it was night and day. When we changed people over, like, for example, even though I main Summoner, when we first cleared Titan, that was done on Black Mage, because Black Mage's damage was literally so much higher than what Summoner was capable of at the time, where it was as bad as a gray performing, in terms of like FFLOX percentiles, like a blue or high gray performing Black Mage was basically on par with a purple plus Summoner and Red Mage. That's how absurd the damage difference was, and that's how ridiculous balance can be early on in expansion. The 14 studio are good at kind of like leveling it out as patches go on. Not so much in Summoner's case, where Summoner goes from like really bad to suddenly god tier in a 0.1 patch. But why it's important to flex? Well, let's just say the jobs that you main is suddenly not that great. Let's just say it plays really clunkily. Let's just say it's miserable to play. Like an iteration of Astro where they had to hard clip everything because Malefic was still base cast instead of 1.5 second cast. That change came about because people were really unhappy with the state of it. And Astro's like potential for raid DPS was not good. And you had to really, really work at it. Like, that's one of the things as well, is people get put off by the amount of effort just to try and compete with a job where you can put in a fraction of the effort and do better. You don't want job balance to be in that state. I find it quite saddening when that does happen, but I mean, it happens. And when it does, adapt or die. Like, that's really my position on that, where I mean, different needs for different groups. If you're not rating at a high end, then does it really matter? Like, your job choice, pick what you enjoy, right? especially if you're among your friends and you're going at a more casual pace. There's a big difference whether you're trying to push for a week 1 clear or whether you're pushing for week 4 onwards. Because the urgency isn't as there. You're going to have like gear helping you out, but at week 1 or like world prog, you need to have the damage to be there, and you need to be able to play the jobs that deal the good damage so you can succeed. Because again, for example, I always remember in Entropy, when they cleared Titan, that Leith was still on Summoner for the clear, and I was like, wow, Summoner's still in such a bad state, but they actually cleared, with that. They did have some S tier DPS jobs at the time, that's for sure. I remember looking at all of the clears for Titan before 0.1, and there wasn't a single group that cleared with 4 bottom tier jobs. There wasn't a single group that cleared like early on with 4 bottom tier jobs. It was all, they might have had 1 or 2, rarely 2, usually 1, and everything else was like really good. And that's why you flex, because you want to play what's good for the time. Because that will give you the biggest advantage for clearing. I hope that answered your question. I mean, that's how I would have viewed it, as like as someone who used to raid lead. I would always, our instances had a player cap of 54 people, and we would have to fill it every day, well, most days a week, and we would have 80 people online, and you couldn't flex the jobs so much because you could only be the one class that you were playing. But I would still have to tailor our raid comp based on who was online. Sometimes I'd have to like swap people in and out on the encounter, especially in prog. If we needed more healers, I'd swap, some DPS out and get healers in. Or if I needed more DPS, I'd swap some other things out, get more DPS in. You have to, it's not just about you being flexible with the jobs, it's about your group also being flexible with the situation.
Okay, let's move on to the raffle. Uh, let's start with 1 year of Discord Nitro. So let me make sure everyone can double check, make sure I have your name. I don't see anyone speaking up, so let me click the button.
Again, thank you everyone for being in attendance and being willing to listen to my rambles today. I like to think that there are some stories that I could share that would benefit people sometimes. And again, all of your tickets, they're going to a good cause with a Safe in Our World, because mental health is something that's really underrepresented, and it's a very important topic for me. And every little helps. So again, thank you for being around, and good luck with the raffle prize.
Our first winner is Azalea. You will receive a code in your direct messages for 1 free year of Discord Nitro. I hope you enjoy it.
Oh, congrats.
Thank you to Discord, by the way, for supplying these codes for giveaway for this event. All right, our next item we'll give away will be 1 Mog Station item valued at $10 or less of your choice. So let me pick that one. All right, congratulations out and now on that item. So make sure you send me a direct message. I don't believe he's here, but we'll get you over the code. All right, we'll do another year of Discord Nitro.
All the nitro, all the emojis.
All right, Linefield, congratulations. I have sent you a direct message with a code for 1 year of Discord Nitro.
Congratulations.
And next we'll do the poster. Kimberk, are you live in the US or Canada? All right, if you want to send me your address, I know that's probably a tough sell, but I can have you shipped out a Final Fantasy XIV poster this week. Yeah, we've given out quite a few of them over the years.
Oh, what kind of poster is it?
I posted a picture. It's I believe Stormblood. Basically, we went to the media tour and we asked for a couple posters to give away, or not the media tour. It was a PAX event, and one of the PR people basically grabbed a stack of like 100 posters, handed them to me, and said, "Have fun."
Bless.
So
That's always
we've
fun.
been going through those posters for a while now.
Hey, they're nice. Have something on your wall like that. You're not gonna get it otherwise from elsewhere.
All right, we got one more Discord Nitro that we'll give away. All right, I've sent that to your direct messages. Screw it, we'll do one more poster since I have a stack of these things. And that was Rubsman. I don't think they're in here. In fact, I can't even seem to be able to ping them. Oh, hold on. Oh, just found him. Tubsman. Okay, I just typoed the name. Go figure. All right. Thanks everyone for coming to our first stage event. I hope you had fun. I'll be posting our next talk soon. Our next talk will be, I believe, June 4th. That talk will be by Illuna.
Ooh.
The talk will be titled, let me find it, Looking East, Understanding the Japanese Community.
I'll definitely be going to that one. Big fan of my friend Iluna.
And as a reminder, that event will be free, as in there will be no ticket. But chances are we will have a charity attached to it. I'll talk to Luna to have him pick out one that he wishes to attach to this, because I do think it is a good idea to attach charitable causes to these. So thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you enjoy.
Thank you again, everyone, for listening to my rambles. If you happen to have like any feedback for like the topic or like the delivery or I guess anything else, feel free to like reach out to me, whether it's like by DMs or like Twitter or whatever. I'm always, my ears are always open, and I always welcome people wanting to have a little natter. So yeah, thank you for having me. I was nervous about it because I haven't done a talk in a long time, but it was nice. So again, thank you for being around, everyone.